Well, kia ora koutou. As promised, I'm going to start putting together some videos to help you with the rest of your assessment. We're going to start with the reflective journal, the second one. I'm going to break down how I would approach it and how I think you should approach it in order to maximize your marks. Remember, there is no right answer. You can have a different perspective from someone else, but there are better reflections, there are better ways of justifying or logically arguing your answer. So I'm going to show you how I'll approach it. But let's start with looking at what the question is itself. All right, let's start by focusing on what the actual question is. So this is what I've written out as part of your reflection. The gender pay gap has been debated by multiple parties for many years. What are your reflections on these arguments? How do you think this gap is manifest in the real world in both pay inequities and/or other structural gender inequities? All right, let's start to break this down. Let me get my highlighter out. The gender pay gap. We are talking about the gender pay gap. Does this thing exist? You will hopefully have already read what listened to Anik's recording from semester 1 and got a view on what this actually is. It has been debated by multiple parties for many years. All right, so we know that what I am looking for is a debate. I am looking to see your reflections on this debate. What does this side say? What does this side say? What are they coming together? What are their differentiations? That sort of thing. What are your reflections? Now, the letter S here is super important. Do not give me one perspective. You give me one perspective, the likelihood of you passing is probably pretty low. Reflections. Give me lots of different perspectives that you have. How do you think this gap is manifest in the real world? All right. How do you think this is manifest in the real world? I've had a few people ask me, what does this mean? Well, when you see something manifest in the real world, it means, does this exist? Do you actually see this? Is this theoretical? Is this what people are saying, thinking? Or does this actually manifest in the real world? Does this exist? In both pay inequities, so is there an actual difference in the amount of money that both men, women, non-binary people earn from each other, and or other structural gender inequities? What are the other structural gender inequities? So think about what other differences exist out there in society. Do we see men, women, non-binary people having different power equity out there in society? Do we have people who have different positions of authority? Do we have different positions of influence? That would be another structural gender inequity that could exist based on the readings that you have done. I provided you with some readings to start with. Below are 2 articles and UC's equal employment opportunities policy to guide your thinking. This word guide is important, all right? Not direct your thinking. I am not telling you to go and look at these and then decide whether it's true or not. I'm telling you this is there to guide you. Again, this is the starting point. 2 articles and the EEO policy. You will need to read these. You will need to see what their arguments are. You will need to decide whether you agree, disagree, what your reflections are on them. And I've put in here as well, the view you take is less important, blah, blah, blah. Make sure you have a thoughtful response. Now, if I get people coming out and looking at this and going, you know what, I've never believed in the gender pay gap, don't believe it exists. Here are some examples of why I don't think they exist. Well, women take parental leave more often. They go into jobs that are typically lower paid, blah, 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 blah. And that is your argument. Guess what? It shows you have not read number 2, because number 2 goes through those myths and tries to debunk them. Now, if you come back with multiple articles that say, actually, the way that this person has debunked these myths can be debunked again, then I think you've got a more satisfactory answer. Are we going to agree with it? Maybe. You have to form a really logical statement, really logical argument as to why you agree or disagree with it. So let's take a look at organizing your answer. Okay, so when you come to plan your answer, read the very bare basics, the 2 or 3 articles that I provided you, the 2 articles and the EEO policy. That should be enough to start you off. Is it going to be enough to get you a good mark? No, no chance. You are going to need to reflect on more evidence. Remember, go right back to lecture 1 that I gave, where if you are just debating based without evidence, you are just arguing over opinions. So without evidence, we're just arguing opinions. I don't want your opinions, I want your reflections. They're very different things. How have you gathered all the evidence? How have you made an idea in your mind? And how have you reflected on what you thought before, what your beliefs were before, and how has that changed, if at all? But give me a restructured answer. So let's start by saying break down your reflection. Break it down into individual parts. Remember, you've only got 600 words, so you don't have a lot, but break it down. What is the gender pay gap? How is it manifest in the world? How have other structural inequities manifest? And I've given you one with regards to power. Are there other structural inequities that you think exist between male, female, non-binary, rainbow, queer, whatever else perspectives you wish to take? Okay, so break down a reflection. Start putting some ideas down, as in, I think it should be this, this, this. Here are the 3 or 4 points I want to discuss in my 600 words. Gather evidence. Justify your position. Now, the way I've been trying to encourage people to write their answers, not just in the test, exam, and the reflections, is very simple. I'll do a separate video on that, but start with a statement. Every paragraph starts with a statement. I think this, or I believe this, or this is something that exists. Explain what you mean by that. So the statement is 1 or 2 sentences. Explain what you mean. That could be 2 or 3 sentences. Give me an example. Statement, explanation, example. I'll go into a bit more depth in my next video on that. But now start to provide evidence. So when you are putting that explanation together for your statement, the examples, show me evidence. Don't just give me your personal experience. Well, I get paid more than my colleague and she has been working longer than me. That's a personal experience, and yes, it is a form of evidence. But if you say Stats New Zealand has shown that there is a XYZ pay gap, and this is manifest when you control across all aspects of age, experience, blah, 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 blah. That is evidence. Let me give you an example from my own experience. I remember we were recruiting for a person in a team here at university, and we used an external consultant, an HR consultant, who said, we've got 2 candidates, both equally qualified, both got the equal experience. You should hire the woman because she's less likely to negotiate, so you can get her for cheaper, rather than the man who, even though he had the same experience, is probably going to want more money. So don't hire him. He's going to be too expensive. We basically went away, and we said that's bullshit. That, from a professional's perspective, to say hire the cheaper person and pay her less because she's less likely to negotiate, that's not good enough. So we actually hired the female candidate because we actually thought she was better, and we paid her whatever we would have paid the guy anyway. What we also did is decide that HR company would never be used by us again as an institution. We said, no, we're going to blacklist them. And we reported back to them saying that sort of attitude that you bring is actually holding back people. Now, the person that told us that was a woman, not a man. It's not that there were men trying to bring down women and hold them back. It was actually a woman. Now, that for me is a personal experience. It is a form of evidence. But if I can show evidence that this exists throughout, and I can weave that into, not only was there a pay gap there, but there was actually a structural gap with regards to women supporting women, or reinforcing that women are less likely to negotiate, therefore we should hire them because it's better for our bottom line. That's not great. How is that manifest in the decisions we make? How do we view people differently? Blah, 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 blah. Start to gather some evidence, not just personal experience like I've just given, but other experiences and other evidence. If you can get statistics, if you can get some international statistics, absolutely use it. Build your argument. So break down your reflection. I'm going to talk about whether a pay gap exists. I'm going to talk about structural inequities, other structural inequities, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to talk about male versus female. You can start there and say, I'm not even going to talk about non-binary or genderqueer or anything like that. Whatever you decide. But then start to build your argument. Paragraph 1, I'm going to say this. Paragraph 2, I'm going to say this. Paragraph 3, paragraph 4. Make sure in every paragraph, statement, explanation, example, and then reflect. Make sure that you have reflection in there. Don't just tell me what you think or what you found, but how have you reflected on this? Justify your position. Tell me why you think that way. Tell me why you've got that position. Have the evidence to back it up, and reflect, like I have said. So keep reflecting. Keep telling us why this has changed your perspective. It's okay to say I started here and I've ended here. It's okay to say I've started here and I've ended this side. It's okay to say I've always believed this and I have not seen enough evidence to justify why my opinion should be changed. whatever that is. I would say that's a pretty difficult perspective unless you have worked in this gender space for a long time. You have gathered a lot of evidence already, and you haven't shifted your perspective at all. Hopefully you are able to reflect on the evidence that you have been given in this class and your own learning outside of class in order to justify your position. And so we do want to see a kind of a shift, is kind of what we're hoping for, and that's probably going to enable you to get better marks. So make sure that you talk about, this is where I was, well, I'm trying to keep in the camera, this is where I was, this is where I am now, and here's the reason why. Reflect on how your perspective had changed. If you can draw in how it's reflected, how you've reflected on this and it's impacted you in your own specific field as well, that would really help. So say, I'm an economist, I've never even thought about this, we kind of believe that X, Y, Z, everything's controlled for, and therefore it's never come up in our studies before. Now I can see it's there. Maybe I'm going to be more conscious of this. Maybe I'm going to be reflective of this. How can I make sure that these inequities that I've discussed, pay and power are two I've given, but you can find others, can come out in different ways. Remember, the question is about pay gap, so make sure that most of your discussion is about pay gap, but don't ignore the other structural inequities that may exist. Do some research. What might that look like? You guys have all come across ChatGPT. Stick it in there straight now. I should do that with you guys in the next slide maybe. Just ask a question of ChatGPT and say, what other structural inequities exist with regards to gender? So let's do that now, actually. That's the top of my head. Let's try that. Cool, so I chucked into ChatGPT, give me 3 examples of structural inequities that exist between genders in New Zealand, give specific examples of what might cause these inequities. Now, ChatGPT is not cheating in my mind. If you rely on this, copy and paste this straight into your reflection, you're going to fail. That's because it's not going to be able to reflect for you. It's not going to provide you with the statistics that you need, blah, 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 blah. And it's not going to provide you with the references. But it's a good place to start, to kind of start your thinking. And the fact is that I've had a few people ask me, what do I mean by this? And they haven't used Google or ChatGPT or other generative AI to at least help them, shows that maybe you're not using the tools that are available to you. Now, using this and just stopping there, you're not going to do well. But using this as a prompt to enable you to do better in the future, perfectly fine. I encourage it. Reflect upon this. So if you do my digital class in 3rd year, I say that you must use generative AI to pass this class. You cannot do it without it because it's the norm that is being used these days. But just relying on it 100%, you're not going to do well. How have you reflected on this? How have you improved? So I asked this question and ChatGPT in about 30 seconds gave me this. It took a little longer than normal, which is quite interesting. So it did have to think a little bit. There's no such thing as thinking in AI. I'm just talking shit now. What is the cause? It's first one, gender pay gap. Exactly what we're talking about. Number 2, underrepresentation in leadership and politics. That's exactly what I said before, the power dynamics between men and women in particular. And it gives you some specific examples. So for example, in New Zealand, although it has had a female prime minister, there has actually been 3 female prime ministers, there remains a gender pay gap in political representation. In 2021, women held approximately 40% of parliamentary seats, highlighting the continued underrepresentation of women in decision-making roles. That's quite interesting. Now, those of you who want to go down this political power line and you feel that's important, you might want to go away and say, actually, I haven't talked about genderqueer at all, haven't talked about trans people in Parliament, and the fact that New Zealand has been very progressive in having non-binary people in power. Does that enhance this question, or does it completely pull it apart and say this isn't actually a great example? Reflect on that, see what you think. The third one it came up with actually with gender-based violence, and I hadn't actually thought about that off the top of my head, but maybe you want to look at this as an example in how there are structural inequities with regards to gender-based violence. How is this manifest in the workplace? How is this manifest in the everyday world? Whatever else it might be. So this talks about domestic and intimate partner violence in New Zealand, and it's very high, absolutely true, one of the highest in the world. Does this manifest in other ways? Does this manifest with microaggressions at work? Does this manifest with absolute abuse at work? What is the evidence to suggest this? What are the cases of this within New Zealand? Trust me, there are plenty. Can you reflect on that? Can that make you think, actually, I never thought about this before. How can I be a good ally in this space? How can I be someone that protects myself in this space? Whatever it might be. So it's a really, really simple way. If you don't understand a question, feel free to use the tools available to start your thinking, but definitely don't rely on it. It's never going to get you enough marks to pass. So I know I was going to keep this short, and I know I was trying to give you some tips, and I've just looked over and it's been like 15 minutes, so I really apologize. But pulling all your ideas together is part of the craft. I know some of you kind of go 600 words, I can pull this out my ass, I can do this really quickly. That's probably why some of you did not do as well as you thought you might in the first reflection and or the test. These are very, very difficult assignments. They are trying to set you up to find the best way to reflect, gather evidence, answer the question. If you use the bare basics, the stuff I've told you, the stuff we've talked about in class, at best you're gonna pass. What we want from you, especially as second year students going into third year, is to go beyond the evidence that's been provided, go beyond what we have given you, and start to build your case beyond that. All right, I'm going to do another video now to help you with regards to preparing for the final exam, but hopefully this has been helpful. If you've got any questions, stick it in the forum. As always, keep there.